in our church, if you're new or new to church or new to understanding who we are, we take this word gospel and we preach and we proclaim it, and we're seeking to live it all out. I don't know if you see on the signs beside me, they say that we exist to declare and demonstrate the transforming power of the gospel. There's a couple assumptions with that. The first is that it's this gospel that changes us. The second assumption then is that we need to be changed. The third assumption is that we're changed when we live our lives with the pursuit of declaring it and demonstrating it to one another and to the world outside of us. In order for that to happen, we kind of need to know what it is. And maybe you've been here for a while and you've heard this term gospel, this word, and you've never been able to attach any kind of meaning to it. And I thought today that it would be good as we look at John chapter 18 to remember again the gospel and see the type of response that is necessary to the gospel in order to experience its transforming power in our lives. The gospel is this: it's the good news that Jesus Christ died for our sins and rose again, eternally triumphant over all of his enemies, so that now there is everlasting joy and hope and peace instead of guilt and shame and death for those who believe. That's the difference it makes. What that says is that the gospel produces hope and joy and peace, and that means that we don't have to. I know a lot of people who are living their lives in that way. They live their lives with the hope for hope. They schedule their lives always with something to look forward to. And that's the extent of their hope, that if they can just plan a trip somewhere warm, that they can hope in that, and that will be a better life than the one they're living now. A lot of people structure their lives for happiness, for what they would deem joy, and happiness is when everything kind of works in your life, right? It's also called peace, but there's a lot of joy that kind of undercuts that, where there's things that kind of feed this need for happiness, for delight, for pleasure. And so they structure their lives around pleasure, and then they also work in their lives in such a way to bring about peace. They orchestrate events and even orchestrate people so that their lives would be just calm. Let me ask you this: does any of that work? Hoping in a trip to somewhere warm is really good until you're on the plane home, right? Seeking out your own pleasure is really good until you realize that pleasure always ends. And seeking out peace by orchestrating things in your life never actually works. All those needs that we have, those desires for hope and joy and peace, were given to us by God, but they were distorted by sin, and sin has replaced our natural inclination to experience hope and joy and peace with grief and shame and guilt. The opposite of hope is grief. The opposite of joy is sin and shame and guilt. The opposite of peace is chaos. And what the gospel says is that God saw our need, gave us Jesus to change all of that, so that we could experience in him this transformative power that would bring about joy and hope and peace in our life. And you may know this, you may even believe this, but our response to this gospel is incredibly important. And it's not just something we say, I believe that, so I'm going to check off my belief box, and then I'm good, right? More than that, it's something that we center our lives around. It's something that we pursue until death so that we can experience it beyond death. It's something that we fight to find its reality in our lives because we know that without it, there really is, at the end of all things, guilt and shame and death. See, the gospel, it confronts everyone. Everyone needs to answer the question, what are you going to do with it? What are you going to do with Jesus? That question, what are you going to do with Jesus, isn't a new question. It's a big question that's been asked for over 2,000 years. It was a question that was asked when Jesus was here on earth. It's a question that is being asked in John chapter 18, the passage we're going to look at today. And what we see is a number of different responses to that answer, who is Jesus and what's my response to the gospel, that really say more about us in our response than it does about him. And I want us to engage that today, and today's message might be a little confrontational. It might be a little absolute. It might offend some of you, but I hope you know you came to a church this morning. And so that's on you. You come here, we believe this. We believe this because we see the need for this in our own lives. Let me tell you what I'm talking about. John chapter 18, we're going to be verse 28 down through 32. I'm going to read a verse, describe the scene. Jesus has been arrested by the religious authority of the day, the Jewish authority, which was called the Sanhedrin. He is in Jerusalem, which is a spiritual city, which is in the nation of Israel, but it was a nation that was actually a province of Rome. So the government of the day was Roman. The government of the day feared Israel because Israel was a powder keg. Their religious culture dictated everything to them. And the Romans had a totally different religious point of view. And they kept trying to influence Israel with that, and Israel kept resisting. Israel wanted to be their own nation, but they couldn't. They were under the control of the Romans. The Romans were very political in their approach to Israel. So here's what's happened, is that the Romans have allowed the religious leaders to have a certain level of authority to govern over religious type of issues. Jesus is a religious type issue. He's been teaching in the temple things that are offensive to the religious elite, things that threaten not just their culture, but threaten their hearts. And so they've arrested Jesus and they've tried Jesus, and the trial's a sham. They're accusing him of blasphemy. They're doing it with so much hatred in their hearts that it really doesn't matter what the evidence says. What matters is what they want to believe. And so they've convicted him already, but they can't kill him because that's what the Romans have said. You can't do this. Besides that, their own law doesn't allow them to do that. So in this situation, what they're doing is they're bringing Jesus handcuffed to the Roman governor of the day, and his name was Pilate. And what they want is they want Pilate to execute him as a criminal. Here's where we pick it up. Verse 23. Then they, the Sanhedrin, the religious authority, led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. This is Pilate's house, who was the government leader of the day. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter to the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. Hey, the time of year is that time of year where they celebrate the most important religious ceremony of their calendar, the Passover. It's their Easter, right? It's the biggest, most important, most significant remembrance and celebration of God's redemptive work in their past. The Passover was a time where they would eat a meal and they would recount and recall the moment in Israelite history when they were under the slavery of Egypt, where they were controlled by these enemies, where they lived outside of God's grace and God's will, but God came and pursued them. God gave them a redeemer. His name was Moses. And Moses came and said to the government authority of the day, Pharaoh, he said, "Let my people go. This is what God says." And over the course of certain events that included water turning to blood, included frogs and different kinds of plagues kind of invading the whole land, and ultimately ended up with God delivering the people through an event called the Passover, where the angel of death came to Egypt and killed under judgment the firstborn son of every home, except for the homes that had blood on the doors. In that case, he passed over those homes. And he saved Israel that day and broke Pharaoh's will, and he sent the Israelites away. He did more miracles for them in order to bring them into new life, including parting the Red Sea. Do you know the story? It's been in the movies lately. So this is what they want to celebrate, and this Sanhedrin brings Jesus to Pilate's home. But what's really interesting is they don't want to go inside. Why? Because they don't want to be defiled. They don't want to be unclean, because you can't be unclean and take the Passover. And they had convinced themselves that to go into a non-believer's home would mean that they would probably become unclean. Nowhere in the law did it say that. Nowhere in their law did it say you can't go into a non-believer's home and take the Passover because you'll be unclean. They just made that up, right? They said, we better be careful that we don't sin in there. We don't get infected with someone else's sin on us so that we're unclean to take the Passover. And what are they missing? They're missing the point. They're missing the point that their hatred of Jesus already condemned them and made them unclean. That it wasn't where they went and it wasn't who they interacted with that made them unclean. It was the sin in their hearts and the hatred in their hearts. And these are people that we call hypocrites. They do all the right things on the outside, and yet their hearts are so full of rebellion and so full of treason because they're so full of sin. See, a hypocrite is careful to perform ceremonies, but they're happy to neglect the most important thing, which is how right their hearts are. And you see how far gone from God they are? What does that tell us? It doesn't mean how religious you are. You cannot have a relationship with God. In fact, you can declare yourselves enemies of God, even in religion. Verse 29, Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him." Pilate, who's the governor of the day, he was one who had gone up through the ranks of the Roman Empire. He'd fought in wars. He'd gotten connected with the right type of people, and he married the emperor's granddaughter, which is a good move if you want to advance. Except that his mother-in-law, who was the emperor's daughter, was the most unliked daughter because she wasn't very nice. She wasn't a good person. And so Augustus, who was the emperor at the time, had a problem with Pilate. He saw Pilate as someone who could maybe manage some things, who deserved some rights and privileges, but he didn't want to honor his daughter who had shamed him so much, so he sent Pilate to Israel and said, you fix Israel and we'll talk after that. So Pilate is first and foremost a politician. He enters into Israel trying to make sure that the peace is held together because he doesn't want bad reports getting back to the emperor. It's very early in the morning. I'm sure he's a little defensive because whenever you're a leader, someone's mad at you all the time, right? And this is interrupting his sleep. They're banging on his door. They want him to do this now. And he says, "What's the accusation?" And what do they say? "Who cares? Doesn't matter. Kill him." Right? It says that right there. It says it in the Bible. Well, not what I just said verbatim, but the spirit of it does. It says it doesn't matter what we think. Honor our judgment and execute this man. You see how their pride is really coming to the forefront, that they've claimed this self-righteous acts, this self-righteous conviction as something that is a right that they have. And they're not even willing to let Pilate hear the evidence against Jesus. See, this is what happens with the ungodly. Calvin says that the ungodly, whom God raised to a high degree of honor, are, as it were, blinded by their own greatness and allow themselves to do whatever they like. How people get drunk on pride. And they've gotten so drunk on their own pride that they're not seeing reality. And Pilate is the voice of reason in this crazy situation. A Roman, a non-Jew, an outsider, a foreigner. And so he pleads for Jesus. Verse 31, he says to them, "Take him yourself and judge him by your own law." The Jews said, "It's not lawful for us to put anyone to death." See, they've already gone from conviction to judgment to punishment. They've said, "We can't kill anybody. It's against our law. You do it." Right? If they believe that God's law is the only true law, they're really happy for Pilate to do all the sinning for them. See what I'm saying? That if they kill Jesus, then they're not guilty. Man, isn't that how pride works? It's manipulative. It's orchestrating events for their own purpose. John says there's a bigger thing going on here in verse 32. This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show what kind of death he was going to die. Jesus had said, they will turn me over to the Gentiles. Jesus spoke about how he would be lifted up, meaning that he would be lifted up to be crucified, and that would be the type of death that he died. And so what we see happening here is not the work of humans orchestrating an execution. What we see is the fulfilled prophecy of God. There's a point where we have to maybe just take a step back and consider what is happening on a human level, but not resign ourselves to just leave it at a human level, that there's something happening also at a spiritual level. Calvin, I referred to him a minute ago. I'd like to speak a quote of his again. He says, "The Son of God is put before a tribunal of mortal man. But if we think that this is done by human will and do not raise our eyes to God, our faith will necessarily be put to shame and defeated." What Calvin's saying is, if we just say that this was an evil that the Jews and the Romans conspired in, that we'll be missing the point. That what we need to see is that there's something bigger happening here. That God is orchestrating these events. That what is happening is that God the Father, heartbroken by the rebellion of his beloved children, showed us his grace and his love, heard our cries under slavery, and entered into human history. That he became flesh in order to redeem human hearts. That Jesus, the Son of God, came as our Redeemer, came as a better Moses to deliver us from the same slavery that so affected the Israelites in Egypt before them. What we mean by redeem is that Jesus came in order to remove the consequences of our rebellion and our treason. What are those things? Guilt and shame and death. Calvin goes on, he says, when we see our condemnation before God is blotted out by the condemnation of Christ because it pleased the Heavenly Father to reconcile mankind to himself this way, the single thought will raise us high, and we shall glory in Christ boldly and without shame. And the Christian hears this and sees God orchestrating these events because his love and his commitment and his faithfulness is so much bigger than the works of men, that God takes an evil event and turns it into something good, which is our salvation. See, a Christian responds elevated to that, loving that truth, resting in that truth, finding joy in that truth. See, that's the difference it makes. It changes our perspective on ourselves and on our lives, because what we see in the gospel is that God is love and God is for us and God is pursuing us, that he is not accepting us with our faults. Instead, he removes our faults and gives us righteousness in Christ. That's it. And the Christian hears that and they're uplifted. Christian hears that and they're joyful. The Christian hears that and they speak this crazy word, amen, because it's true and we need it. See, the Christian understands that they need it. The Christian understands that this isn't for someone else, this is for me. And when they see that the cross is about them, it's then that they begin to pursue this peace and joy and love that declares eternal triumph over all the enemies of men. You see, Christ's death occurred because of the love of God for you and for me. Our sin required Christ's death if we ever wanted to be reconciled with God now and for eternity. And the problem is that we often forget this. The problem is that Christ is still on trial if we don't actually pursue this gospel. You see, the Christian sees that Christ has died by their hand, by their sin, but he has given redemption through his death and his resurrection that we might have new life. And so for them, Christ is no longer on trial, but for others, Christ continues to be on trial. That question, what do we do with Jesus, is one that confronts each of us, and the Christian knows the answer to that, that we trust in him. But in that day, they didn't know what to do with Jesus. You see, there's a number of different responses here, and I'd like to speak to this for a second. First of all, we see how the ungodly respond. This is the ungodly, are the religious elite, the very ones who should have recognized Jesus when he came, who should have responded out of their need for him, declare war against him. And they're antagonistic towards Christ. Their pride makes them resistant to the acknowledgement of their own truth that they are sinners. See, what pride tells us is that we're good people and we just need to do good things. All right? And if we say that over and over and over to ourselves, our chest gets pumped up. We feel good about ourselves, and we walk around not needing Jesus at all. See, the ungodly, they want nothing of Christ's lordship in their lives. The ungodly want to remain in the justification of their sins and control their own atonement, control their own salvation. That's what the ungodly do. We also see the response of the unaware. Pilate is living his life, doing his thing, and Jesus interrupts it. Jesus shows up literally on his doorstep, and Pilate has no opportunity to prepare. He has to make a quick judgment for reasons that really don't belong to him. He's trying to sort all of these things out, and so he approaches it first and foremost as a politician. He's career-minded. He wants to make sure that there is no trouble in the land, but he also wants to judge fairly. And so as a politician, he's trying to get all the facts so that he makes the right decision. But not only is he a politician, he's also a pluralist. Do you know what a pluralist is? It's somebody who worships many gods. You see, he was a Roman, and the Romans worshiped different gods in different places for different reasons. Basically, if you had a specific need, you would find the God that would meet that need, and you would worship that God. This is what Romans did. They worshipped any and everything. And what happened, what came out of that, was it made this idea that truth is whatever you want it to be. That there are many, many different ways to God because there's many different gods. He has concluded that truth is something that is relative. We know that because later on in the chapter, as he and Jesus are having an interaction, Jesus says, I am the truth, and Pilate responds, what is truth? But he responds rhetorically. He's concluded that there is no actual absolute truth. And this really is his worldview. It's how he's going to live his life. He's going to say, there's many ways to God. Who am I to say that there's one way? Right? That's his conviction, his religious background. Then we have the uninformed. And the uninformed are the crowds. They don't pop up in this story, but they're going to play a very significant role as the days carry on. The uninformed are the ones who get emotionally connected on the basis of a very, very naive opinion. I call them uninformed, but that doesn't imply that they're not opinionated. We know this because we live in a day and an age where you've got to form an opinion very quickly. And then you've got to attach some sort of value to that opinion that you're willing to fight for. Right? The news will come on, Brian Williams got fired. He's a bad man. That's what everybody in the media tells us. So I guess that's how we're supposed to feel. Right? There's no grace, there's no empathy. There's just this indignation that is rooted in this self-righteousness that allows us to form our opinion with a group of people that what we'll call the majority, the moral or immoral majority. Choose your side, I don't really care. And form an opinion and make conclusions without understanding what is really happening. You see, when Jesus entered into Jerusalem, the uninformed got really excited. This was a fun event. Here was somebody who said they could be king. You know, they think, well, let's get on this team for now. Okay, so they jump on Jesus' bandwagon. A couple days later, they start hearing Jesus teach some very hard things about commitment to God, meaning that they would have to leave everything. His teaching convicted them. And they decided to jump off his bandwagon and join another bandwagon. Sounds like a lot of hockey or football fans that we know, right? Who do I cheer for today? Shame on you. Right? And that's what they're doing. They're forming opinions, and they're getting all fired up. And in our day, in our age, we form our opinions quickly, but without thought. And our opinions are formed and our emotions are engaged, but it's only for a time. And that time usually is the 24-hour news cycle when we're moving on to new opinions about new things. So that's what the crowds were doing. Jesus was a part of their life for a few days and then they moved on. But they had very strong opinions about him at the time. They were uninformed. And finally, we see that there were ones who are unstable. And these are the disciples. These are the disciples, the ones who had been with Jesus from the very get-go. These are the ones who had heard Jesus teach, there's going to be a day where I'm going to suffer and you're going to suffer with me. But it's important that that suffering happen in order that the kingdom be inaugurated, in order that God would rule over the whole earth and that you will rule with me beside him. And what did they hear? They heard that. We're going to rule with Jesus one day. What didn't they hear? The suffering. Right? What this means is that they were Christians when it was all good, when it was easy. But when things got hard, they're like, what? Jesus, I thought you were going to save us. I thought it was going to be different. I thought. No, you didn't think in the beginning. You weren't listening at the forefront. And what ends up happening with the unstable is they compromise their values. They compromise their commitment. You see, it's easy to be a worshiper when we like the worship. But I'm always amazed at the defensiveness of the committed people when pushed towards true lordship in their lives. That's the basis of our worship. When God calls us out, when God calls us to change. When God calls us to change, it means tension's going to happen, adversity, suffering. And we're like, whoa, wait a second. God, if this is happening, this isn't fun, this isn't easy, this isn't joyful or hopeful or peaceful. This isn't what you promised me. And they compromise themselves. And they walk away sometimes, but to the faith. You see, these are the responses of the people in this narrative at the time of Christ. But Christ is continually on trial, and the responses of those mirror the responses of people today, the responses of many of us in this room. You see, each one of them convict Christ in their own way. The ungodly who are threatened by Christ, who are threatened by his authority in their lives, they convict him because he's a threat to their conscience. He's a threat to their worldview. You know, this happens when we come to Christ and Christ says, I've forgiven you, now you need to go forgive everybody in your life. And you're like, well, wait a second. I don't think I want to do that. And so we hold on to bitterness and resentment. Or God says, I've forgiven you. Now I want you to go ask forgiveness from somebody. Well, wait a second. I don't really want to do that. That doesn't make me feel good about myself. And what we're doing when we do that is we're protecting our conscience because Jesus is a threat to that. We're convinced that we don't need to do some of those hard things, those real things, those vulnerable things, if we're just good people. You know what, how about Jesus, instead of asking forgiveness or forgiving somebody, I just go to church some more and I give a little bit more and I share a little bit more and I read my Bible a little bit more. How about that? And what we convince ourselves of is that that's enough, and it's not. And what we're doing is we're simply becoming hypocrites. The unaware, they convict Christ. They convict Christ by refusing to be personally involved. You see, they just don't want to make a decision. They don't want to come down on an absolute truth. They want to be inoffensive. They want to say that there's any number of different ways to God, that you shouldn't be so closed-minded, that you shouldn't have a box so tight that it doesn't allow other truths in. But in trying to resist this judgment, they condemn Jesus because Jesus himself said that he was the only way to God. And instead of taking advantage of the opportunity to find God through Jesus, they decide to get up in their high ivory tower, unaware of the spiritual implications on their own lives, and say, you know what? We should just be friends with everybody. We should just learn to coexist. We should learn to accept one another without this condemning nature, without saying that there's only one way to God. And they convict Christ by refusing to be personally involved in it. See, the uninformed, they're swayed by the age of opinion. And unlike the unaware, they become emotionally invested and completely for a time, and they sway. Sometimes they're really on fire for Jesus, like on that Palm Sunday when Jesus came into Jerusalem. But then slowly, things will change there, and their opinion will change, and so will their emotional attachment to Jesus. And they'll hate him, and they'll resent him. And they convict Christ in an emotional response that is neither informed nor passive. They respond with great defensiveness and choose their camp. They are swayed by public opinions. And they, in turn, just come to conclusions that are false and wrong about who they are and about the attachments that they have, and they don't get involved in that. And finally, the unstable, they follow Christ according to circumstance. That when it's good, they worship, and when it's difficult, they are racked with doubt and often compromise the values of their commitment to Christ when adversity comes their way. They convict Christ with inaction as ulterior motives for following are exposed. Everyone follows Christ. Every true follower of Christ follows because of the grace bestowed on them. But a lot of people call themselves Christians, call themselves followers of Christ in order to please somebody else, in order to get out of hell. Any of those reasons are just, they're not good enough, right? We need to be so affected by God's grace and his commitment to us that we respond to the degree to which we can in the same kind of commitment to him. The question before those in that day was similar. Was Jesus guilty of calling himself God when he wasn't? The ungodly, the unaware, the uninformed, and the unstable all responded in their same way. For us, maybe the question is coming to you today. Is Christ God or isn't he? Is Christ God or isn't he? Now, which one of these four responses is yours? Is it an ungodly response? Is it an unaware response? Is it an uninformed response? Is it an unstable response? Which one are you? Which one are you really? Maybe I'm being a little pushy. Maybe I'm putting you in a box. Maybe you think I'm trying to sell you a car. Here's the thing, you can't be neutral about Jesus. What does it mean to be neutral? It means to put the car out of drive and into drift mode. You can't be neutral about Jesus. You can't be neutral about it because his commitment to us was so great. You see, our commitment in response to him needs to be a wholehearted commitment. And that means that being a Christian isn't about being a gun-toting, Bible-thumping, church-going Jesus freak. It means that being a Christian isn't about precious moments and cliches that we put on our fridge or on our doors or anything like that. It's not about having a cause like saving the redwoods or the whales, and it's not about worldview. Being a Christian isn't like being a vegan. It's about a wholehearted commitment to Christ. And it's not those things because Christ isn't a politician. Jesus didn't have a public agenda. What Jesus knew was that as hearts were changed, so would the social environment of every community and every region in the whole world. Jesus didn't have a political agenda because he knew that the problem was in the hearts of the people. But that as people gave over their lives to Christ, he would change the world through them. See, Christianity is not our cause because Jesus isn't a politician. Jesus isn't a cliche. He's not a good luck charm that we carry around with happy sayings like, let go and let God. We don't say things like, when there seems to be no way out, let God in. He's not our bumper sticker that says, headed in the wrong direction, God allows U-turns. Here's the thing, our Christianity is not the jewelry we wear because Christianity is not an accessory. It's not something that we put around our neck to pretty ourselves up when we feel like it. It's not a cliche. Finally, Jesus is not a consultant. You see, a lot of people think that Jesus is their life coach and that his sole purpose is to help them figure out how to live their best life now. Like that the thing that Jesus is worried most about is how healthy we are and how wealthy we are. And what Jesus is saying, you need to die to yourself. And you need to accept being poor in spirit that you might experience the fullness of my grace. Jesus is not a life coach saying try this or do this and maybe your life will be a little bit easier. Jesus doesn't have a book with his face on it. He doesn't. He's got a book that points to him. And anybody with a book with their face on it is selling you a gospel that is simply false and oppressive. See, here's the thing. Either Jesus is God or he's not. Either Jesus died for the sins of the world or he just died. Either Jesus rose from the dead and defeated the enemies of mankind, or he's still enslaved to that power. Either Jesus is at the right hand of God interceding for us and our need, or he's dead in the ground. There's no and or. There's no agree to disagree here. It's either he is God or he isn't. But we live our lives resisting answering that question, choosing instead to wallow in obscurity. And in so doing, we do it because we want to be in control of our lives. And Jesus threatens us because what he says is, you're not as good as you think you are. You're not as righteous as you think you are. There is only one way. I'm the way. It's not about your opinion. It's all about me. It's not about the good times and the bad times. It's about me showing you that even in the bad times, I am still good and I am still great. You see, we're Christians, not because it makes our lives easier. We're Christians because Jesus holds the whole world together. Because Jesus saw that our greatest need was not adversity and not suffering and not pain, but it was guilt and sin and shame and death that drove us away from God, that he pursued us to reconcile us, to give us grace. That's why we're Christians. See, being a Christian, being a committed Christian is about hating your sin because it cost Christ his life. It's about hating our morality because it only feeds our pride. It's about hating our religious tendencies because it only feeds our ungodly appetite for self-righteousness. See, being a Christian is about hating our sin, but it's also about hearing about grace, the answer to our hatred of sin and self. It's not about finding our value in anything, but the love of God that pursued us in spite of our sin. You see, being a Christian is about being loved by an absolute, never-ending, unstoppable love that no person or circumstance can change, not even ourselves. Being a Christian is about worshiping Jesus because he is worthy, because he is righteous, because he's changed our reality, because he's changed our spirituality, that we might become children of God. You see, being a Christian is about being so profoundly moved by the grace of the gospel that we make it our mission that everybody experience it. It isn't our cause, and Jesus isn't our life coach. Jesus is the grace of God personified. He's the love of God given to us. And the only response is to not cast doubt on his deity, to not challenge his love and his grace, to not question our lives to such a degree that he may or may not be involved in them. It's instead to turn and to say, I will follow you. I will follow you because you have been good to me, because you have loved me, because you have been gracious to me. Because you hold the universe together, and because you hold the universe together, you hold my life together. We follow you, Jesus, because he was foreknown before the foundation of the world, but was made manifest in the last times for our sakes, Peter tells us. This is why we follow Christ. Maybe you're here today and you think you're a Christian. You think you're a Christian because you think it will make your husband or your wife happy. Maybe you think you're a Christian because you were born and the first Sunday you ever lived, you went to church. And you've gone to church every Sunday after that, and that's what makes you a Christian. Maybe you think you're a Christian because you desperately want some friends, and you think Christians are supposed to be nice, and maybe you can make some friends. Maybe you're a Christian because you desperately don't want to go to hell, but you're still scared of going there. Maybe you're a Christian because you need some sort of cause. You need some sort of opinion about certain events in the world, and Christianity is your cause. Maybe you think you're a Christian because you need to feel good about yourself. What I said today doesn't answer any of those things. Christianity isn't going to make you feel good about yourself. Christianity can take away the fear of hell. Christianity can strengthen your relationship with your husband or your spouse, but this is about you, and it's about your hearts, and it's about your response. And maybe Maybe it's time that you acknowledge that you've been following Christ for the wrong reasons. Maybe it's time that you acknowledge that it's time to stop sitting on the fence. Maybe it's time that you acknowledge that you now know enough to make a decision. And all you need to know is that you're a sinner that Jesus can save. That's it. You don't need to know any more than that. Maybe it's time to make that decision because until today, it's never been about Jesus dying for your sin and releasing you from the power of hell. Maybe it's time to make that decision today because it's never been about God's love for you and the truth that He literally moved heaven and earth for you. Maybe it's time to make that decision today. It's the time to make the decision to trust in Christ alone for salvation. I'm going to invite you to bow your heads and to pray with me. This is an opportunity to take a minute with God. This is an opportunity to ask yourself the question, is Jesus God? Do I need the gospel? If this is the first time that God has really made His gospel personal to you, I'm going to pray and you can pray along with me. Pray a prayer that responds to this, that confesses that Jesus is Lord and that God raised Him from the dead. And if for the first time you want to pray that prayer, let's pray together.